Hi friends, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to my little baby apartment. We're not in Kansas anymore. As today is the last day of June, I thought that the first video I would film when I got back here was my June wrap up and talking about all of the books I read in June. My favorite read of the month was definitely After Dark by Murakami. This got added to my favorites shelf of all time, and I feel like every time I try to talk about favorite book, I just have this like inability to express just why I love it so much and all the little pockets that I fell into it in and all the pockets it provides you spaces to fall into, because this is a book of magical realism all set during the late night hours of one night in Tokyo, from midnight till almost 7 a.m. following encounters and crisscrosses and connections and nodes and points of intersection between people, all in the very kind of lonely, particular, strange places and back alleyways and random meeting zones of Tokyo and the people who occupy those spaces during the nighttime. Murakami almost suggests that people who are awake during the nighttime and people who occupy the spaces of the nighttime are entirely different people from the people who occupy daytime spaces, and that was such a cool idea. He deals with the space and time of night, and night as this whole other world, not just a whole other temporality, and night as a temporality able to create a whole other world. Hence why it feels just so magical, realism-y throughout the whole thing. It was just beautiful. Mainly this book focuses on following these two sisters. We first meet our first sister, Mari, at Denny's at like 12, and she's sitting there reading a book, trying to very much be this person who blends into the restaurant's dimly lit background. But then this other man comes in, Takahashi, and he plays the trombone, and he asks if he can sit down next to her, and it turns out that he knows her sister Eri because they met years ago in high school or something like that. Maybe it was college, who knows. We find out that Mari and Eri are sisters, but they have some troubled things in their relationship, troubled burdens and everything like that. We find out Eri is sleeping for most of this novel. There's a huge Sleeping Beauty aspect that kind of weaves in here and tries to connect Eri's life together with kind of the nightlife and the day life, and the whole reason of why she is sleeping is very interesting and how she is sleeping. So there's that storyline, and there's just a whole 100 other little flares and flickers of human activity crossing over with one another. So beautifully written. This definitely took one of my top favorite Murakami novel spots, and it just reminded me of like so much magic that comes out during the nocturnal hours. And not only that, but this book provides you a soundtrack with which to read it with. Almost every single chapter contains a different song, and like I've mentioned before, it has timestamps at the top of the page to always let you know what minute of the midnight we're dealing with. And it was just so insanely beautiful and magical and sparkling. It was like bubbling, fizzy water. Yes, I absolutely loved all of the ideas that Murakami presented in here and went over, and it's a book that just makes you want to reread it immediately after you finish it and ask yourself so many more questions, because there's so much in here that isn't nicely tucked in for the morning hours. It's very much kind of open-ended thing that you know will continue even after you're done reading this book. Like, it's a book where you finish the last page and you think the story is still going on without you. We're advancing into a new night and new experiences and new expectations, and it's so sweet, so lovely, such a lonely little pocket of life that Murakami presents you with, and it's so good. So I give 5 stars. Definitely my favorite read of the month. A very close second favorite would definitely have to be The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This is my first time ever going into N.K. Jemisin. If you don't know, The Fifth Season is a fantasy, kind of an apocalyptic fantasy, if you will, where basically Earth experiences 5 seasons, as the namesake would suggest. But the 5th season is not a mashup of spring or summer or some nice little flourishing season. It is just death and destruction in a variety of forms. The 5th season contains people called Origins who can sense, detect, and they're just like earthbenders, let's be real. It's Avatar. They can control and kind of progress or suppress earthquakes and natural phenomena relating to the earth and rocks. Unfortunately, when this novel begins, for the inhabitants of Earth, much like the inhabitants of 2020, they are entering an apocalyptic time in their lives. So the 5th season opens and we are following 3 different perspectives from 3 different women, and eventually we see how kind of their narratives mishmash together, much like After Dark. That was one of my favorite things in this book, was how the narratives intertwined and how they related to one another. I'm not going to spoil anything because it's one of the great, not really mysteries, but one of the great revelations of this novel when you get to the end and when you get near the end. But that was a huge thing that I just admired so much and found so interesting, was how N.K. Jemisin just, it's not really tricking you, but it's leading you down one path, and then eventually when that path just ends and you drop off into the face of the earth, it's just so good. I enjoyed the fantasy elements of this book so much, but even more than that, I've talked about this a little bit before, how fantasy novels, or whatever genre it is, it combines or sprinkles in and puts in a little dash of huge concepts and huge literary things that are going on in the background or even beside the fantastical or the apocalyptic or the dystopian, whatever is going on in the novel. And N.K. Jemisin was so just like masterly at doing that, and it blew me away. It deals so much with how individuals in our lives are different people at different times in our lives, and really insisting on the notion that people change so completely, becoming a whole different person, or how the life cycle of our life is so changing that, like the seasons, if we looked out the window, we wouldn't really be able to tell what season of our life we were, and perhaps we wouldn't be able to recognize ourselves a lot further down the line. And it just dealt with so much humanity and so much progression of someone's individual life and what they go throughout the whole cycle and season of their life, and that just really blew me away. More than that, I thought the fantasy and everything that it embodied and everything that it like took on and tried to do was so interesting. The system is so cool, so well done. I loved every single character in here, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Insane. I cannot wait to read the next one. Okay, next up, I think I'm going to move into some historical fiction, because I read a few historical fictions this month. The first one was The City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert. City of Girls is set in 1940s New York, right before America enters the Second World War, and we're following this girl named Vivian. She's very vivacious, is a good word, very loud, very bold, very not really concerned with a lot of the things that she finds her peers concerned with, mainly one of the reasons why she's kicked out of Vassar College. Her parents are so fed up with her that they ship her off to New York to live with her also kind of out of line aunt Peg, who runs a playhouse called the Lily Playhouse, where they put on very mediocre, subpar kind of Barnacle shows that hardly anyone shows up to, but theater is just her aunt's passion. So Vivian is very quickly kind of swept away into this world of showgirls and entertainment and business, and her main function there is seamstress and costume designer, because she learned like this insane, somehow prodigy sewing construction of fabric skills from her grandmother. Shout out to my grandma, because this is one of her old shirts. One thing I need to compliment probably first is the atmosphere. The atmosphere is so good, so thick. I just loved it. It covered everything with this like blanket of magical jazz juice and like glittery sequins of 1940s New York, and just everything that was going on, the language obviously that's being used, and just the description and settings and the way people exist in City of Girls is so interesting, so good. There's never a moment where you're like, why would someone ever say that? It felt very authentic and it felt very real, which is why the atmosphere was so atmospheric. City of Girls is all told actually in letter formats, because we have our main character Vivian, and now she's nearing the end of her life, and she gets a letter from another woman asking her how she knows this woman's dad. And Vivian is like, listen, I don't want to upset you, I don't want to give you the wrong impression of me, I want you to know all of the facts about who I am before you make your judgment about how I knew and was entangled with your father. So she basically thinks it is prudent to write out her whole life story to give this poor young woman Angela for her to read, and then kind of make a judgment on Vivian as a person and to judge the relationship and the kind of love story of her and Angela's dad. So that is really what this book is about, but I was a little bit hesitant about the romance, but it really doesn't appear until almost 75 or 80% of the way through the book, and it is so worth it and such like a new, fresh, interesting connection between two people, because for most of the novel we follow Vivian's very scandalous for 1940 and very promiscuous lifestyle and the way she is judged and shamed and what kind of the showgirls from her aunt's playhouse are doing, all of the shenanigans that they're getting into, the way people react to that, the way people judge her. She eventually has this huge scandal that gets released into the press when Edna Parker Watson, who is a very famous actress from the 1940s, comes to perform at the Lily Playhouse, and she gets in a bit of trouble surrounding things with Edna Parker Watson, and she's eventually shipped back to wherever she's from, and she has to go through that, and it was just so interesting. So by the time that romance really gets introduced, you have all of these ideas about it, and then the romance just becomes something so contrary and something so easily seen for what it really is, and it's just so beautiful. It deals with the aftermath of World War II and how people try to rebuild and reconnect, and how theater and music and arts and everything like that played a huge part and a huge role in that, and it was just really, really good. It was really good. So that was the first historical fiction I read this month, and I really loved it. The second one I read was Warlight by Michael Ondaatje. This one I ended up loving not as much as City of Girls, but it's a book I kind of appreciate and can like see the value and the craft and just everything that makes it historical fiction, but also very much literary fiction and fiction concerned with like performing its literariness, because Michael Ondaatje is just, it's good. Even though I didn't personally click with this novel and really engage with it in a way that I wanted to as much as City of Girls, I still really found it really fascinating and gave it 3.5 stars. I gave City of Girls 4 stars. Warlight also deals with the aftermath of World War II, almost right after the war closes. We're following these two siblings, Nathaniel and Sarah. Nathaniel is our main narrator, and this whole book is him trying to unmask and unveil and kind of shove a torch into the war-lit years, and specifically just like light up and illuminate the spaces where his mother and father existed in those war years, because his mother and father abandon Nathaniel and Sarah right after the war ends, because they say they're going on a trip to Singapore. We very quickly find out this is not true. Their mother and father leave them in the care of this very strange, enigmatic, shadowy figure called the Moth, and his surrounding cast of criminals and characters that surround him and his daily life and his daily activities. It's not really a detective novel, but there are so many detective aspects in it and so many scenes where you just feel like Nathaniel is trying to shine a flashlight with his words and kind of figure out and untangle the mess of what his mother, specifically his mom Rose, was doing during the war, because there are all these strange connections that crop up. We find out that she didn't really go to Singapore, and then this whole novel is really searching for why she did the things that she did, because we find out she's involved with these huge criminal acts that occurred during the war, and it also kind of deals with what happens when criminal skills and other people's skills who haven't been convicted of anything wrong yet are employed in World War II doing all of these things, and then the war ends and suddenly all of their deeds that during the war were okay and were even perceived as being just super good and useful and talented for the war effort are then condemned, and sometimes even to death, in regards to spies or people who are doing shady things or smuggling and everything like that. The main thing that this novel just blew me away with, it is called Warlight, and as you might have guessed, this novel deals so much in light. It's like a book that's written more with light than words, and that was so fascinating. Every scene is lit with a different kind of light: torchlight, a gas stove, a single street lamp, the backlight of a fireplace. Obviously one of our main characters is called the Moth. It's just like a novel filled with so much shadow and light and kind of the play of what happens when those things meet, and that kind of gray area where you can't see a lot. And that is what our main character, Nathaniel, is going through, trying to come to terms with his relationship with his mother, his sister, and all these people who are influencing him and helping him grow up. It's definitely a novel where so much more is revealed kind of by what's not said and what is left untreaded and unilluminated rather than by what is said. Another image that's probably useful to explain this book is that there's so much imagery and symbolism concerning maps and the way maps are made, and especially war maps. Very early on we see Nathaniel in his father's study looking at a map that is not correct, that's not true, that doesn't show everything that's there in case it falls into enemy hands or something like that. And then it's just so relevant to childhood and the way that we perceive things as children versus when we grow up or when the war ends, and now we can have full maps that reveal everything, and when we're older we can examine our childhoods and see so many things that weren't clear to us then but that now are, or even how some things looked when we were children versus how they look now, and just huge evolutions that take place in a span of sometimes a few seconds when you're an adult, but when you're a child that took you how many years, probably like 17, 20 years to come to terms with and deal with and really map out and explore and examine the terrain of your childhood, especially a childhood during the shadowy, dusky, middling lightliness of the years after World War II. So it was just really, really well done, but I just didn't why didn't I like this book? I'm really saying good things about it. Yeah, so it was 3.5 stars. Realistically, now that I'm saying all these things about it, it probably should be 4 stars. Missed this. We should also probably very quickly talk about my most disappointing read of the month. I think you guys have probably heard me talk about this book a lot recently, so I'm not going to go over in detail all of my problems with it. There's even a whole like hour and a half live show that you can go watch over on Carolyn's channel at Carolyn Mary Reads, because this was our Dark Academics book of the month, and I gave it 2.5 stars. This was just such a huge letdown, not only because this tried to be one of my favorite genres, that was also one of my main complaints, was that the dark academicness in this book was just so there was just a void. We're following Alex as she wakes up in a hospital bed and is being offered a very strange position by a strange man to oversee and monitor and keep tabs on the secret societies of Yale, who are supernatural homes that can do magic and work with ghosts and monsters and demons and portals and a whole lot of other things. From there we follow her getting mentored by her mentor, Darlington, and basically all of the things that are going on until one day a girl is found dead on campus, and the whole affair is trying to be hushed up, but Alex thinks there is definitely a connection between the girl's death and the houses of Yale, the 8 houses of Yale. This was just so incredibly disappointing. The writing was a sloppy mess, the construction and the plot was a sloppy mess. There's so many things that don't line up, don't make any sense, aren't properly explained. I think the social commentary that tried to insert itself in the book was way too assertive and way too in your face. I was all for the social commentary and the kind of classism that was being called out and the problematic aspects of very powerful, literal powerhouses of universities and the way that they're run and the way that governments and institutions and establishments and essentially money-grabbing, grubby places work and infiltrate and use these universities to, what's the word I'm looking for? Educate the society in a very particular way in regards to these power structures was going to be so interesting and so valuable and so useful, and it was just not well done at all. It was so it felt so performative, so fake, so fabricated, and it was just incredibly disappointing. Every aspect about this book was so disappointing. I do not recommend this book at all. Like I said, if you want more in-depth thoughts, I have a lot of vlogs and a live show about this book. So that is Ninth House. The next book I read was a lot better, and that was Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. This was just a world of interesting, a world of creepiness. I wish I had kind of been able to read this with my own eyeballs because I listened to it on audiobook, and it was so cool. Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead is a horror story. It is a fairy tale. It is a thriller. It is a book about a serial killer. It is a book about madness. It is a book about animal rights. It is a book that is a little bit like a Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf retelling in a way. This book is set in the very remote wintry landscape of a Polish village that borders on the Czech Republic. Our main character is the most quirky, unreliable, strange narrator that I've met in quite a very long time, and I loved her. I found myself relating so much to her ideas about animals and the way that people eat, and this is a very delicate surgical study of violence and hunting and eating dead corpses, essentially. It is so interesting though, because unlike Ninth House, where commentary on something, in this case why we kill animals, Ninth House did it so blatantly, so in your face. Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead is very interesting. It's a book that makes you think about the issue so much and think about who we give voices to, who is allowed to speak, the way that we perceive violence, who can perpetrate violence, the way that crime is committed, and then the way that that committed crime is analyzed in regards to gender and speciesism and animals. And it was so interesting. Oh my gosh, it was so interesting. I think this book would have personally impacted me more if I didn't really guess at the mystery, or if I wasn't already someone who agreed with our narrator and agreed that it was wrong to cause undue harm and suffering to animals and to kill animals in order to eat them, which is a need that isn't a need anymore because it's not required, it's not necessary. And I think it would have really hit me harder if I wasn't already in that space. But it was still so interesting because our narrator is just so... she's got a lot going on in her life, let's say that. She's a middle-aged woman living in a remote village, and she essentially takes on the task of catering and looking after people's homes who come for the summer from Warsaw. So in the winter, hardly anyone is there except for her and a few other lonely neighbors. On the night that this book begins, one of her neighbors, who she calls Bigfoot, ends up dead. They find him in his kitchen, and he has apparently choked on this little tiny bone. There is so many spooky elements in this book. Our narrator immediately jumps to the conclusion that he has been killed by vengeful deer who have stalked him, gone into his kitchen, and murdered him. From there, we follow a string of other murders and other killings and other dead bodies that start cropping up in this village. We find out that our main character, she spends her time translating Blake. A lot of this book is so infected and infused and given so much of Blake's words, especially from one of his famous poems called Auguries of Innocence, where he talks about animal abuse and violence against animals. And so many chapters are prefaced with lines from that poem. For example, a robin redbreast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage, or a horse misused upon the road calls to heaven for human blood. Things like that. So creepy, so interesting. She also spends her time studying astrology and mapping out people's lives and people's end of lives, how they're gonna die, why they die, and just kind of trying to really specifically pinpoint every atom of someone's life via astrology. This book deals with isolation, loneliness, being cut off. It deals with so many borders. Obviously, we have the literal border that's right there and that our main character comments on obsessively between Poland and the Czech Republic, how everything in the Czech Republic is so much better than where she is and everything like that. And it deals with the border of insanity and insanity. It deals with the border between women committing crimes and men committing crimes. It deals with the border between people who choose to eat animals, people who don't choose to eat animals. It was just such a good, wrapped up, spooky story. There's so many creepy elements in this book, and there's ghosts, and there's dreams, and there's memories, and there's hauntings, and there are insane people doing insane things on both realms of the spectrum. Some are very blatant things, like murdering another human being. Some are very quiet things, like shooting a deer to eat it for dinner. and the way that these two ends of the spectrum converge in this novel to be met with the same violence and the same condemnation and the same wrath. So interesting. Gave it 4 stars, really, really loved it. I'm really excited to read more of Olga Tokarczuk's work because this was so well done. It did win the Nobel Prize, so there you go. That is Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, which is a line from The Merits of Heaven and Hell by William Blake. Also in June, I read the first manga I've read in a while, which was Tokyo Ghoul Volume 1 by Sui Ishida. I really ended up liking this. I gave it 4 stars. I would really like to find the next volume because this was just so much fun. It was so fun. Basically, if you haven't seen or read Tokyo Ghoul, we're following this guy named Kaneki, and he is finally able to go on a bookstore date with this girl because he's so enamored with her because they read the same damn books. They go on the date, at the end of the date, she tries to eat him, so he finds out that, whoops, she is a ghoul, and then he wakes up in a hospital bed with her organs transplanted into his. That was, okay, that's like my main problem with this book, is that part was just so unbelievable because the doctors are like, drop them in, even though they have no consent or permission from either of these people to be smushing around and playing games with these people's organs, but they do. From there, this book really follows kind of the ethical dilemma that our main character faces with becoming a ghoul, wondering if he should kind of give in and start eating humans and preying on humans, or whether he should starve himself and not do that. So that's kind of what Volume 1 deals with the most. It also deals with kind of the secret world where human and ghoul meets in school, at work, via his friends, and it was just really, really interesting. I loved it. It was super fun, super interesting. There's a lot of cool quotes, and there's a lot of like literary influence because Kaneki, our main character, is very much an avid reader, and he identifies himself a lot with Kafka's character from The Metamorphosis, who turns into a giant insect. So that was really cool, and I just overall really love this. 4 stars. Let us move into the nonfiction. I read 2 nonfiction books this month. The first one I gave 5 stars. Insane. I think I'm gonna have some trouble trying to voice and talk about this, so let's try. The first one is The Vietnam War, An Intimate History by Jeffrey C. Ward. This was first a documentary, and then it was kind of novelized. This is a very, very long, thoroughly detailed, really well done nonfiction book about the Vietnam War. The audiobook was over 30 hours long, and it took me a very long time to get through, not only because of its length, but because I had to take a lot of breaks reading this book. I had to step away from it for a while and eventually go back to it, and in the end I gave it 5 stars because like I said, so well done. It comprised so many interviews and letters and real journals from people from all over the world, and obviously from both sides of the war, both sides as if there's 2, every side of the war I should say, and everything like that, and it detailed so much, so many in-depth operations and everything that everyone was going through basically at the time. Not only was it about the war, but I love that it encompassed so much more of everything culturally that was going on in the 60s, 70s, even 50s. I also love that it starts so much earlier than before the actual Vietnam War starts. It begins roughly in World War I, and it gives you the backstory of Vietnam, what the country was going through, what the country looked like, versus kind of just the evolution leading up to the Vietnam War, and then eventually the book ends with the withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam. This book made me unspeakably angry, and at least for me, I had a preconceived notion about how badly done and badly waged the Vietnam War was, but when you read this book, literally every single thing is just so mind-boggling. America's inability to do anything correctly surrounding this war is just insanity. It's insane. Like the shots that are being called, the way the presidents dealt with this. I love how it gives you a lot of in-depth summary on the leaders of America, the leaders of Vietnam, the leaders of other places that are connected and involved with this war, and that were basically allowing this war to proceed and go on and be waged. It was just, I don't really want to say too much about it because this is a book I would highly, highly, highly recommend this book to anyone, but it's definitely a book that going into without someone saying a lot to you, I think is more beneficial. Once again, 5 stars. supremely well done. I cannot praise this book enough. The next nonfiction book I read in June was unfortunately not as well written, and I only gave it 3 stars because I had a lot of problems with the way that it was put together. That book is The Civil War by David Fisher. As the title suggests, this is all about the Civil War. I did give it 3 stars because I learned a lot. I found myself learning new facts about the war and everything like that, but I think one of the main, probably the main problem I had with this nonfiction book was that it focused so much on individual generals and their lives and their heroics and basically just their whole backstory and their lives and so many details of their battles and their bravery, and it would go off on little anecdotes and stories and everything like that. That would have been fine because not that the Vietnam War didn't do that, but it only did that in balance with everything else equally. The Civil War did this so much. I don't think it did it enough for me to properly call it like military fetishism, but it just felt very strange because that's not, for me, that wasn't the most important thing. I wanted to learn so much more about like just what was going on rather than the author going off on these tangents about Ulysses or what's his name, or Stonewall Jason, or all of these other guys who were doing things. This book also felt a little bit like going to one of those recreations, what are they called? The battles and like reenactments, yes. This book felt a little bit too much like a joyous reenactment of the war rather than trying to explain the causes and everything like that. It only dealt with like a fraction of the racism and the cultural everything that was going on during the Civil War and before the Civil War and after the Civil War. I would have liked it to have had a more kind of streamlined, continuous examination of that, but it felt like only a little bit at the beginning of the Civil War was dedicated to that, and then it kind of just took off as this thing. A lot of this book is also dedicated to discussing Abraham Lincoln and his assassination and the conspiracy and everything like that. Like a lot of this book is dedicated to that, which is great because it's so interesting. I learned more new things about Lincoln and his eventually end, but that just wasn't, I don't know, like it's called the Civil War, didn't really encompass what I wanted to be encompassed in the Civil War, so that's why I gave it 3 stars. Another book I'll briefly talk about that I enjoyed a lot because I just found it very entertaining and the audiobook was really well done was Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie. This was my second Agatha Christie book. This is part of the series of obviously the Hercule Poirot murder mysteries, and this one was set in Egypt on a steamboat that's cranking down the Nile, and obviously someone ends up dead. In this case, it is a very famous socialite called Lynette Ridgway, and she has just married her best friend's boyfriend, Simon Doyle's. So they're on their honeymoon, and her spited best friend Jacqueline is stalking them. She shows up everywhere they are, and it is no surprise that she shows up on the same steamboat that is taking them on their honeymoon down the Nile. And unfortunately, Lynette is found shot in the head in her bed one night. Obviously from there it's just your famous classic Hercule murder mystery where he interviews all the suspects on the boat. There's a lot of engaging, interesting caricatures surrounding this kind of trip down the Nile, and it was just really good fun. I love Agatha Christie's murder mysteries, so I really enjoyed Death on the Nile. Another really fun book that I read and that was just so entertaining and that I love so much more actually because this book is a sequel was A Gathering of Shadows by V.E. Schwab. This is the second book in the Shades of Magic series in which we're following Delilah, Cal, Rye, Alucard, and a whole host of other magical people as the Essentosh, or the Element Games begin at the Capitol in Red London, and we're following a whole host of magicians competing against each other for the top title of magician, of who can kind of wield the elements of magic the most handily. I wasn't super impressed with A Darker Shade of Magic, so I was a little bit hesitant to see what I would think of A Gathering of Shadows. It was so much better. The first book is actually pretty dark and pretty heavy, and it deals with a lot of bad stuff going on, whereas A Gathering of Shadows was honestly just fun. This was just a really fun book from start to finish. We go on so many adventures. We have pirates. We have Delilah being Delilah and stirring the pot and causing ruckus where there really is no need for any ruckus, but she causes it. We have Kel being a really sad boy for this whole book. I feel so bad for him. We have Alucard, who is now my favorite character in this whole series. Also, his last name spelled backward is Dracula. Don't really know what that entails, but that is a fact. This book was just so fun. So fun. There's just so many fun things going on that it was just so fun. The second last book I read in June was The Flat Share by Beth O'Leary. This was a contemporary romance in which Leon and Tiffy, our two main characters, move into a flat together because Leon's trying to save on money. He is a nurse who works more often than not the night shift, and Tiffy is an editor at a book publishing company. Why do they always work at book publishing companies? I don't know. This was a really interesting romance because it kind of, maybe I shouldn't examine it this much, but like it kind of deals with like figuring out who someone is just by the residue, the human debris that they leave behind them, whether that's how much of a mess they leave in the kitchen or kind of what their spaces look like when they aren't inhabiting them. So that was like cool. That was an interesting concept that was kind of worked in. In terms of the romance, I didn't really enjoy it. Like it was a little cutesy. They obviously communicate via sticky notes for most of this book, which is really interesting, and there's like a double love story going on because Leon works with a lot of elderly people. One of these people is trying to find their long lost love from World War II, so it's just a lot of like cute things going on. However, this book actually deals with a lot of really dark, deep issues in terms of abusive relationships, and for example, Leon's brother is in jail for most of this book, wrongly accused of a crime he did not commit. So it really focuses a lot on those deep, dark issues, which are so important and so valuable. But I think, at least just for me personally, when I went into this romance, I just wanted a really cute, easy, like no stakes, no value, minimal plot, let's be honest. And that's not really what you get with The Flat Share. So it's definitely a more of a plotted romance, I guess. I did end up liking The Hating Game a lot more. I really have not, I think these are the only two romance books I've read this year, so I really have hardly anything to compare them to, but I did give The Flat Share 3 stars, so that was The Flat Share. The last book that I listened to in June was called Islands of Decolonial Love by Leanne Batasmasak Simpson. Islands of Decolonial Love is a collection of poetry, short stories. It's called Stories and Songs, so it's a lot of put together little snippets of poetry and little short recollections and storytelling, all from the point of view of the Indigenous experience in Canada. It was also really cool because a lot of this book is set in parts of my country that I'm like very familiar with, and that a lot of them I've actually been to myself, which like I hardly ever get because Canada is such a sparsely populated place. So I feel like I hardly ever get the chance to experience my locale or places that I've been to in someone's work. But with Islands of Decolonial Love, that was even more interesting because it's all from the point of view of these Indigenous people who are going through their lives in modern day and trying to deal with the horror and the abuse and the racism and the essentially decolonial love that they are trying to foster and harbor between themselves, or a love that is strong enough to decolonize what has been colonized, which was so powerful. A lot of these stories are they'll start one way and then she'll very subtly insert one line that absolutely crushes you and changes the whole, I don't know, put togetherness of the story, and it's just so, it was so good. It was really, really good. A lot of it is so heartbreaking, and a lot of the book, I think she describes it as kind of dealing with the balance between living a loving and observant life versus trying to deal with the generations of horror that have come before you and that have been literally inserted into your DNA. And it was just really always kind of balancing on that tipping scale. Alright, so those were all the books I read in June, and I'm very excited for July because I finally got my full power of my TBR, my physical TBR here, so I'm excited to see what I'm gonna read in July and excited to keep making a lot of these videos. I plan to film like honestly a video or two every day because I'm here and I've built up this stack of little ideas of videos to film. So if you guys have any recommendations, always leave them down below because I am now ready to film some stuff. So But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I always love hearing what people's favorite books of the month were, what book kind of made the most impact on you and stuff like that. So yeah, I hope you're all doing well. I'm very excited to be back here with you guys, and yeah, I am gonna go turn my very noisy air conditioner back on now because I am sweating. Other than that, I will see you very, very soon in my next video. I hope you are all keeping beautiful and beautifully well as well. So